Hello and welcome. So today we're going to talk about governesses. It was a big part in both Anne and Charlotte's writing, of course, Jane Eyre and Agnes Grey, and I think it's a really good subject to look into. I've had lots of fun researching it, so come on, let's go and have a look. So, what was a governess? Well, of course, she was a teacher within the family home, but on top of that, she was a mother, a moral guide, and in some ways an example, even though obviously not in the career department, because nobody wanted their daughter to go on to be a governess unless it was really necessary. So she was also a companion and a chaperone, because of course when the girls of the household got that bit older and they wanted to mix with gentlemen, you needed a chaperone. So it wasn't just teaching, there was so much more to it as well. And I think for a young girl going into this particular role, it must have been really difficult. Suddenly overnight you are a mother, a teacher, a guide, a companion, you have to make decisions for a small person or a slightly older person, and you yourself are still a child. Who became a governess? Well, normally it was young women. We say that because obviously they were cheap and they were enthusiastic. The older they got, the harder it was to find jobs, but they weren't uncommon. Either you were middle class and you couldn't be kept by your family for whatever financial reason, and therefore you needed to earn your own money, or you were from a rich background and the family had fallen on hard times and you needed that way to make your own money. And of course, being a governess was sociably acceptable, whereas anybody who went out and did bar work or worked in a shop or a factory was classed as working class. So whether you're middle class and above, the only option was to become a governess, which seems pretty rubbish to me. Or marry a rich man, that was your only other option. So who employed governesses? Really hard word for me to say. Why is it when you say a word so many times, sometimes it just doesn't sound right no matter how much you say it? Now I'm starting to question the word governesses. That sounds like a Scottish island, doesn't it? Governess, governesses. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, so who employed a governess? Ideally, you want to work for a rich family, where paying conditions were that much better. Most of the family had probably been taught by governesses, so knew how to treat them. They knew what was expected of them. YouTube won't let me show you this video, but I hope these screenshots give you an idea of what's going on. And of course, in the large house, you will get your own room, which is probably nice size, and maybe even your own sitting room. So again, great advantage. Also, if you're from a rich family and you have to go out and be a governess, you're suddenly going to be surrounded by the sort of people you are used to in your own class. So you know how to behave and how to act. So suddenly you're comfortable again. Wages were normally better in rich houses. Again, they were used to governesses. They knew what the going rate were. They knew what was needed. Again, YouTube said no, so here's some screenshots. And also you might have the chance to travel. If the family go on holiday, there is no way they're going to want to look after their own children, and you could go with them. So there's the chance of getting out and about and seeing things you probably wouldn't have seen. Upper middle class started to employ governesses. It was like a status symbol. It was almost like trying to get that higher up the class system. But the problem with that was that that some of the mothers obviously had never had a governess before and didn't know how to treat them, didn't know that they weren't quite a servant, but then again they weren't part of the family. And some mothers became jealous because obviously suddenly your children are with this person all the time. You also found that the mothers might interfere, not quite used to standing back and letting somebody else discipline their children. So there was always that worry of the interference when you went to a upper middle class family. Being a middle upper class, the rooms in the house were smaller, so the chances are you would just have your bedroom and you wouldn't have a sitting room. And of course we go back to wages. Wages in upper middle class were not particularly great. So the governess might be more of a lady than the family she's working for. She might have come from a good background or a good family, and of course this makes the mother feel on edge. Is the governess looking down her nose at her? Is she judging her? Does she think she's not a lady? And of course that can cause huge problems. So what does the job of being a governess involve? Well, obviously teaching, mostly girls between the age of about 5 and 18. And obviously you're preparing them for marriage. So hopefully by 18, they're off on their merry way with their new husband. Sometimes it's boys, but most of the rich upper class families choose to send their boys to boarding school after the age of about 8. This was quite common in the mid-19th century. So if you do have a boy, it's only for a small amount of time, and you're very much teaching them the basics, 3 R's, reading, writing, arithmetic, because once they go to boarding school, they're taught like a man, you could say. So the girls would be taught English language. You need your daughter to be able to speak properly, says me, who can't get my words out. She needs an understanding of geography and of course conversational French. You want her to be able to have a conversation, but no more. You don't want her to know business French. You don't want her to embarrass her future husband at the dinner table by knowing more than he does. And of course then you've got history. There's always good to know your kings and your queens and the basic things like that. And of course there were other lessons involved. The lessons for life, you could say. The singing, I don't know if you could call that lesson for life, but it turned you into a lady. Singing, piano, sewing, dancing, you know, things like that that were expected of a young lady of that status. And then of course you've got the modest behaviour, the correct way to behave, etiquette, how to be within crowds, how to keep up conversation. All these things were so important to what would hopefully be one of the ladies. And then there were things like Bible reading to help them to become a good Christian, because that was very much a standard thing for all children in the 19th century to know their Bible. What did the governess get in return? Well, from reading Jane Eyre, I can imagine we're all expecting not much. And I'm sorry to tell you, yeah, you're right. So wages were between £30 a year, which is about £4,000 in today's money, and £80 a year, which is about £10,000 or thereabouts in today's money. And of course this is the mid-19th century we're talking. So this is the time when the Brontes would have been governesses, or around about. You would get your room, you would get meals, you could have your laundry done, but as I will explain later, Charlotte Brontë found out that yes, there was a deduction for that out of your wages, surprise, surprise. And then you would have time off, but not much, I'm afraid. But you did have the knowledge that you were not a burden on your family anymore, and that was priceless. No longer did your father have to try and cover your expenses and your cost of living, and that was worth a lot. But there were problems, let me tell you about them. Governesses weren't the family, so they weren't from the upstairs, but neither were they servants from the downstairs. So they found it very difficult to know where their place was and who to confide in, which of course made them very lonely. They had no one they could talk to, obviously not the children either, and all their friends and family could be miles away. And nowadays we can get in a car and get anywhere within a few hours, but not back then. Obviously the servants resented you. because you weren't one of them. You were more like the upstairs, and they had to cook meals for you and they had to wash your clothes. So they weren't very happy to have you. They used to call governesses stuck up and things like that because, you know, they treated themselves a bit better than the servants, and they didn't have to wear a uniform either. And of course, if you were from a better class of family than the family that you're working from, there's that resentment all the time, that worry that you're going to say something or do something that the family disapproves of. One of the big problems that many governesses used to talk about was the fact that they could never earn enough to be able to save for that old age. Because once they finished being a governess, what was there for them? If they hadn't married and they don't inherit, what happens when you can no longer work or get employment? It was really difficult to think about the future when you have no idea how you're going to cope. The other thing that I read about quite a lot was that children, the discipline. Mothers didn't like the governess doing the discipline, especially in the upper middle classes, and would often take the children's side and look down their nose at the governess for telling their darling children off. So this was always tricky. You could imagine you're being told to teach these children, but they're horrors, and you can't stop them from running riot. And then the mother walks in the room, she can see it all kicking off, and yet you're told off because of the children's behaviour and for telling them off. I mean, it must have been awful. You can't do right for doing wrong. And of course, you might have multiple children to educate. If you've got 3 or 4 and they're all at different stages, it's very difficult to spread yourself around the room. And of course, the work was very hard work. It was long hours. You were up at the crack of dawn, you were teaching, you would take the children out in the afternoon for a walk, maybe to get them burn off some energy, but you were with them all day, and the amount of time or little time you had off for yourself was very small. It might be the time that you wrote a letter back home or that you slept. You know, there wasn't much time for anything else. For one of the problems for the employer is, how do you know this woman's any good? You can get references, but are the references from people who just want to get rid of your governess? And at the end of the day, if your governess is teaching terrible French to your child, that child will learn terrible French. But that's how it was. There was no real qualifications. There was no expectations that they must know a certain amount. So some houses had loads of governesses, because of discipline issues, because of education, because she didn't get on with the family. So again, not a very stable job. You never quite knew what was around the corner. What does an employer want? Well, if I was looking for a governess, a plain girl. This was the most common thing asked for. You don't want an attractive governess. Could you imagine the scandal if your eldest son fell in love with the governess? It would be awful. So they don't want a beauty in the house that's going to turn heads. And also don't want them for the staff, the visitors, anybody. You want somebody very plain, very sensible and well presented to teach your children. You also want them from a good background, and I don't necessarily mean a good family, but you want them from a respectable background, because this person's going to be giving your child moral guidance. You want them to come from a good household. Someone that's going to prepare your child for marriage. So you need them to teach them well, but no more than what a male knows, because the last thing you want is your daughter embarrassing herself at the dinner table in front of your guest because she knows more about geography than the suitor at the end of the table. I mean, could you imagine? A good reputation. So the last thing you want to hear is that this woman that you've employed is always down the pub on a day off getting drunk and chatting up all the men. You know, she's representing your household. You don't want a drunk or a flirt. And of course you want them to have good Christian morals and cheap. And that was something I kept seeing everywhere. You want a bargain. Which sounds awful when you think this is somebody's life, and basically you want them to do everything: a mother, a teacher, a nanny, a confidant, everything, but you really want it for a good price. It just seems awful now, with modern eyes, of course. know what, I'm coming to the conclusion that actually being a governess was an awful job. Why would you do it? I know why you would do it, because you need the money, but oh God, could you imagine that? If your father came to you, lived in a beautiful rich house with all these lovely things and horses and lovely dresses, and your father came to you and said, I'm ever so sorry, but I've lost everything I own and you've got to go out and work, and guess what you're doing? Yep, you're looking after someone's horrible children. You would be absolutely gutted. You can see why you would marry any spotty little man that comes your way then. Well, I don't know. Governess, spotty man, not sure. And you might only see this job advertised in the newspaper with a tiny little snippet, and you couldn't Google them to find out what the family were like and have a little look on their Facebook page to see if they were a nightmare or not. So you would write to them, tell them who you are and what you can do, and they go, yeah, go on then. And you would just turn up with no idea what they were like as a family, unless someone knew someone. But if you'd answered a newspaper article, goodness knows what you were turning up to. I wonder if many girls turned up at jobs, took one look at it and went, no, I'm off, and turned around and go home again. That's like blind date of the governess world, really, isn't it? Crazy. So let's talk about the Brontes. Only 2 of the 3 sisters actually were governesses, and that was Charlotte and the youngest, Anne Brontë. Emily, thank goodness, was never a governess. I mean, I couldn't imagine how she would have coped with the restrictions and the expectations of being a governess. It would have, well, she wouldn't have survived, I don't think. She wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. But let's talk about Anne. So Anne's first job was from April 1839 to the end of the year with the Inghams. They were mill owners and they owned Blake Hall in Mirfield. She was only 19 years old when she started, so she was still really young. So the children were Joshua Cunliffe, not sure how you pronounce that. Put it in the comments to help me along. I'm not quite sure how you would say that. And he was 7 years old. And then there was Mary, who was 5 years old. And they were so badly behaved. And I really do think Anne's novel Agnes Grey, the children were based on these children. The mother would blame poor Anne for her children's behaviour, making it such a difficult place to work. So like we said before, it was Anne's fault that they ran riot, not the children. But reading and looking into it even more, no, the children were absolute nightmares. So then Anne went on to spend 5 years as governess to the Robinson family, the well-known family in Thorpe Green, from May 1840 until June 1845. And she was the longest employed out of all the Brontë siblings. So the children was Lydia Jr., Elizabeth, known as Betsy, and Mary. And she managed to teach them discipline and self-respect in the end. And this really paid off because they really started to care for her. And they bought her Flossie as a puppy, the Cavalier Spaniel, because they really appreciated what they did. And I thought, that's lovely. Oh, a puppy. Anyone want to buy me a puppy? Feel free. Yeah. But can you believe this? Anne earned, whilst at Thorpe Green, £40 a year for looking after 3 girls. Okay. And then when Branwell came to look after Edmund, the one boy, he got paid £80 a year. That's double what poor Anne was getting for one child. Right, can you see the injustice there straight away? This whole male-female divide? Yeah, and we talk about unfair earnings now for men and women. Wow, back then. So let's talk about Charlotte. Charlotte had a temporary role with the Sidwich family for 3 months in 1839, and she found that position really hard. And I talked about the Sidwich family in one of my previous videos, and I will put a little link up here for you to have a look. Charlotte's second experience of being a governess was in 1841 at the house of John White, a Bradford merchant who, with his brother, had inherited Upperwood House in Rawdon from a wealthy uncle in 1818. He and his wife, Jane, had 3 children. There was Sarah, who was 8, Jasper, 6, who Charlotte taught, but there was Arthur the baby, who was only 2, so luckily she didn't have him to look after. In a letter to Ellen, she said, "In taking the place, I have made a large sacrifice in the way of salary. in the hope of securing comfort, by which word I do not mean to express good eating and drinking or warm fires or a soft bed, but the society of cheerful faces and minds and hearts not dug out by a lead mine or cut from a marble quarry. Charlotte's salary was certainly very low. It was only £20 a year. I mean, this was a lot lower than the average. £4 had to be deducted a year for her laundry. Can you believe that? This was exactly half the sum that Anne was earning in Thorpe Green, despite the fact that Anne was younger and less experienced than Charlotte. It's really not hard to see that both Jane Eyre and Agnes Grey, with their governesses in their main story, was based on the two sisters' employment. It's very obvious to see this. And then, when you look back through history, an example is, in 1851, the census revealed that 25,000 women earned their living as a governess. That's unbelievable. The Governess Benevolent Institution was founded in 1843 and incorporated in 1848. And this organisation was created to support governesses in need. They provided temporary assistance, granted annuities to elderly governesses, and even offered a home between jobs for a small weekly fee. Additionally, they ran an asylum for aged governesses connected to the institution. Charlotte Brontë wasn't too keen on this institution, and she was known to say, both absurd and cruel. She felt that women were being taught to expect too much when many employers were still underpaying and expecting too much from these very young women. Here is something that Charlotte said. No one but myself can tell how hard a governess's work is to me, for no one but myself is aware how utterly averse my whole mind and nature are to the employment. Do not think that I fail to blame myself, or that I leave any means unemployed to conquer this feeling. Some of my greatest difficulties lie in the things that would appear to you comparatively trivial. I find it so hard to repel the rude familiarity of children, and I find it so difficult to ask either servant or mistress for anything I want, however much I want it. It's less pain to me to endure the greatest inconvenience than to request its removal. I am a fool. Heaven knows I cannot help it. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about governesses. It sounded like an awful job, and I must admit, reading Agnes Grey really put me off ever doing anything like that as a career. The children were horrific. Anyway, so thank you for watching. I know I ask this every time, but please do the whole likey, subscribey thing, because it really does help me out, and it lets YouTube know that we want to watch more Brontë content. And I think it's wonderful, all your comments that you send me and all your suggestions and all your feedback. It's great, so thank you. And thank you for watching. I can't believe so many people are watching my videos. It really warms my heart, so thank you. So I will see you all next Friday for more Brontë adventures. Until then, see you soon. Bye.